Never dismiss the bark. That was the one rule Sergeant Mark Hanley drilled into every new recruit. And on that crisp October morning, it might have been the one thing keeping a child alive. The sun had yet to rise above the ridge, and the air was dry, so dry it carried red dust into your eyes, ears, and mouth. Mark adjusted his cap and narrowed his eyes toward the canyon's edge. Everything looked ordinary rock's brush, signs of a minor rock slide from the night before. Nothing unusual, except for Bruno. Bruno, a 4-year-old German shepherd, wasn't sniffing for bombs or following a scent. He was pacing his alert, tail stiff, nose working overtime, as if the air itself warned of something unseen. Suddenly, he stopped. His ears swiveled. Then came 3 sharp barks, followed by a low growl, then silence. "Easy, buddy," Mark murmured, fingers tightening on the leash, but Bruno didn't move. His focus was fixed on something hidden past the gnarled junipers and splintered shale, somewhere in a narrow ravine that hadn't seen a footprint in decades. They hadn't planned to stay long. The sheriff's department had called them in for a routine perimeter sweep after a student went missing during a weekend school outing. Most of the kids had been accounted for by yesterday evening. The terrain was rough, but this wasn't expected to be a full-blown search operation. Mark keyed. His radio static crackled, then a voice. "XO1, status check. Just wrapping up the north side. Dogs showing signs of alertness," Mark replied. "Copy that. Bring him in. We're closing up in 20. But Bruno barked again, louder, more urgent. Mark glanced down. Bruno had planted his front paws, pulling gently on the lead, not straining, just enough to say, "We're not done here." "I don't think he's ready to leave," Mark muttered. He unclipped the leash. "All right, show me." Bruno took off like an arrow, low and fast, heading toward a tight stone chute cluttered with broken limbs and fallen rock. What happened next wasn't in the manual. But after 15 years in search and rescue, Mark had learned one thing. When a dog like Bruno signals something, you trust him? About 80 yards ahead, Bruno halted at the base of a slope, where slabs of stone fit together like an unnatural puzzle. He began digging, nose pressed against a patch of disturbed earth. Then came those 3 short, precise barks. Again, a code, a message. Mark caught up moments later, heart pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Gravel slid under his boots as he crouched next to Bruno. "What is it, huh?" he whispered. "What have you found?" Bruno looked directly at him, then let out one single, quiet bark, measured, deliberate dot. "It's here." Mark pulled a crowbar from his vest and wedged it beneath the largest slab. It didn't budge. Whatever was buried had been tightly pinned. He called for backup, his voice sharp now. "Command, we have confirmed K9 alert. Possible entrapment. Sending coordinates. Requesting excavation crew and medical evac on standby." "Copy, Echo 1. Do you have a visual on the missing child?" Mark paused. "Not yet, but I've got a strong feeling." Bruno was lying down now, chin resting on his paws, eyes locked on the same spot, watching, waiting, guarding. Within 20 minutes, the first responders arrived. Tension came with them. "You sure about this, Hanley?" the lieutenant asked, eyeing the canyon. "There's no sound, no movement." Mark didn't respond. He just pointed at Bruno, still motionless, utterly focused. Not even his tail twitched, so they began to dig. Fingers blistered, knees scraped, the morning sun climbing higher as they removed one rock at a time. Then a sound barely audible. A faint whimper, a breath. Bruno jumped to his feet, tail giving a single wag. "Hold on, quiet." Mark barked. Everyone froze. Then again soft, muffled. A cough. Wholly one of the volunteers whispered, "Someone's down there." Minutes later, after more frantic digging, they uncovered a small hollow beneath the stones. Just big enough to fit a small body curled in on itself. First, a shoe scuffed, striped. Then a dusty leg. Then an arm. The boy was unconscious. His lips cracked, his face bruised and pale, but he was breathing. They had found him. 18-year-old Luke Jensen had fallen during the hike. No one saw it happen. His teachers assumed he'd joined another group. His friends thought he'd run ahead. But Luke had slipped between layers of limestone, triggering a minor slide that sealed him in like a tomb. He'd been trapped for nearly 20 hours. Nobody would have searched that spot. It wasn't even on the maps. Nobody, except Bruno. As medics loaded Luke onto a stretcher, Mark knelt beside Bruno and scratched behind his ears. "You did good, buddy. Real good." Bruno gave a quiet grunt and finally sat down. Job complete. Someone nearby said it out loud. "That dog just saved a kid's life." Mark didn't reply. He just knew it was true. They hadn't gotten lucky. They were alive, because a dog sensed what others couldn't, because someone listened. And because heroes don't always wear uniforms sometimes, they come with 4 legs. A gift for finding the impossible, and a bark that refuses to be ignored. The sound of helicopter blades echoed through the canyon as Luke was lifted into the sky. Paramedics hovered nearby, checking vitals and adjusting oxygen. His small hand, still caked in dust, twitched slightly as the chopper disappeared above the cliffs. A short distance away, Sergeant Hanley stood with arms crossed. Red dust streaked across his face in sweaty lines. Beside him, Bruno sat calm, tongue out, harness snug on his chest. He had earned his meal, his rest, and every ear scratch he was about to get. But Bruno wasn't the kind of dog who asked for thanks. He didn't chase tennis balls. He didn't beg for treats. He just saved lives. He worked, he served. And that morning, he saved a child's life. As the last of the first responders slowly cleared the scene, many took a moment to acknowledge Bruno. Some gave him a gentle pat. Others just offered a respectful nod if greeting a fellow comrade. Charlie, the young volunteer who had spent most of the morning digging through stone with bare hands, looked at the shepherd like a kid meeting his favorite hero. His voice was quiet when he asked, "Do you think he knew all along?" Mark gave a faint smile. "He always does. The real challenge is getting the rest of us to believe him." Charlie knelt to pet Bruno again, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's not a dog, that's a miracle in fur and muscle." 2 hours later, Mark and Bruno were back at County Search and Rescue HQ. The adrenaline had faded, and Mark was running on fumes. Bruno, on the other hand, still looked sharp, quietly pacing the break room, tail gently wagging. Bark poured himself a stale cup of coffee, left a second one untouched on the counter for whoever walked in next. His body ached, knees sore, shoulders heavy, but that wasn't what was bothering him. It was the thought of what might have happened if they hadn't listened to Bruno. Leaning against the counter, Mark watched as Bruno sniffed at a small pile of gear. A blanket, a cracked radio, gloves still stained with canyon dust. His mind drifted back to the day Bruno arrived 3 years ago. Freshly retired from military service overseas, he'd lost his handler in a blast. The official report said Bruno refused to leave the body, staying by his partner's side for hours. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, just waited. Loyal to the very end. They said he was done. Mark muttered to himself. Guess they were wrong. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the atmosphere was tense but filled with hope. Luke's mother, Karen Jensen, had arrived just 10 minutes after the helicopter. She hadn't stopped trembling since she walked through the doors. Her hand gripped the nurse's arm like an anchor, her eyes wide with fear. Is he, ... did he? She started to ask, but couldn't finish. He's alive. The nurse replied gently, still unconscious, but stable. A mild concussion, dehydration, a cracked rib, but no internal damage. You made it just in time. Karen's knees gave out as she sank into a chair. Her purse hit the floor, forgotten. Hands over her face. She broke down raw, gut-trenching sobs, pouring out all the guilt she'd carried through the long night. I thought he was with another chaperone group. She whispered between sobs. I should have checked. I should have known. You're here now, the nurse said softly. He's going to wake up. He's a strong one. Luke opened his eyes 3 hours later. Disoriented, groggy, blinking at the harsh hospital lighting. He didn't speak at first. Then came a whisper of a question, barely a sound. "Where's the dog?" Karen leaned in, brushing his hair back, holding back tears. "You're safe. Now, honey. I'm right here." "No," he said, voice rough, but steady. "The dog. The one that barked." Karen looked at him, confused. "What dog?" Luke coughed, wincing a little. "The dog barked. That's how I knew someone was coming." The story made the local evening news. By sunrise, it had gone national. Search dog locates missing boy in Colorado Canyon, K9. Refuses to leave until trapped child is found. Boy rescued after 20 hours, thanks to heroic German Shepherd. News outlets couldn't get enough. Everyone wanted the story and they all wanted Bruno. Mark, meanwhile, kept his phone off. He wasn't interested in cameras or sound bites, but his department had a different view. Good press meant good funding. And Bruno was about to become a name people remembered. Thursday morning, a news crew from Denver arrived. Mark had shaved, put on a clean uniform. Bruno had been brushed, his harness polished. They filmed a segment in Luke's hospital room. The boy smiled for the first time in days. His hand resting gently on Bruno's back. Bruno sat quietly, patient and calm as if he understood the moment. "So, what made you follow him that day?" The reporter asked Mark. Mark hesitated for a second. "I don't know. Just a gut feeling, I guess." Then he glanced at Bruno and smiled. "Or maybe I've just learned that sometimes the best instincts don't come from people." That night, the rescue video posted to YouTube passed 500,000 views. Comments poured in from all over the country. "This dog deserves a medal." "God bless K9 teams. I cried watching this. What an amazing animal." Mark scrolled through the messages silently. He didn't care for attention, but he was proud. Bruno was curled beside the couch, tail twitching in his sleep. Mark looked down and whispered, "You're not just a dog. You're my partner." He meant every word. 2 days later, an official letter arrived from the governor's office. Bruno was being awarded a formal commendation, a medal for bravery, normally reserved for fallen officers or distinguished service. Mark read the letter. Aloud, Bruno barked once, then trotted off like nothing had happened. Typical, Mark laughed. Save a life, earn a medal, still expect dinner on time. The ceremony took place outside the county courthouse. The afternoon sky was a clear blue, with just enough wind to make the American flags hanging from the courthouse columns flutter gently. A small crowd had gathered: neighbors, teachers, local first responders, and some of Luke's classmates. At the center stood Bruno, with Mark on one side and Sheriff Delgado on the other. Luke, now discharged from the hospital, but still favoring one leg, stepped forward and handed Bruno a chew toy tied with a small blue ribbon. "You're my hero," he murmured. Bruno gave a soft bark in response. His ears perked up, tail swaying behind him. A photographer caught the scene, Luke grinning up at the dog who had saved his life, and Bruno, calm and proud, simply doing what he was trained to do. Later that evening, back at home, Mark removed his badge and unfastened Bruno's harness. He opened the refrigerator, pulled out 2 grilled chicken breasts, one for each of them, and took a seat on the porch steps. The first stars were beginning to dot the sky. Bruno settled beside him. Chewing happily, Mark looked up, then glanced down at his partner. "You ever think about how close that kid came to becoming just another headline?" he asked softly. "And how no one would have thought to look that way if it weren't for you." Bruno stayed silent, eyes fixed on the darkness, ears twitching. At sounds only, he seemed to notice. Mark exhaled slowly. "People need to understand, it wasn't just luck. It was you, loyalty, heart." He reached out and gently scratched behind Bruno's ears. Not bad for a guy who almost didn't get a second shot. Bruno leaned into the touch, tail thumping once against the porch, and for the first time that day, Mark allowed himself a quiet smile. It had all started with a photograph, one single frame capturing the moment. Luke Jensen slipped a ribbon around Bruno's neck during the courthouse ceremony. A bruised but beaming boy in faded jeans. A focused, steady dog that somehow seemed to grasp how important the moment truly was. By morning, the image had gone viral. Time magazine reshared it with the headline, "Loyalty on 4 legs." Talk shows began calling. A children's book publisher reached out about a picture book titled Bruno the Brave. A small-town mayor from Idaho offered to fund a statue. One enthusiastic online personality even suggested a GoFundMe for Bruno's retirement. Mark Hanley wasn't quite sure what to make of the sudden attention. He'd always kept a low-profile, quiet missions, quiet exits. No awards, no spotlight, just the work. Just the dog. But Bruno wasn't just any canine anymore. He had become the nation's canine. And Mark, he was trying his best to keep things as normal as possible. But normal had changed. One morning, Mark walked into the command post to find the front desk piled with packages, handwritten notes, toys, drawings, and treats sent by children from across the country. One envelope, glittery pink with hand-drawn hearts, read in uneven cursive, "To Bruno, I love you, you should be president." Mark chuckled. "Might do a better job than some of the ones we've had." Captain Reyes stepped in behind him, coffee in hand. "Heard they want to fly you two out to New York." "Who's they?" Morning America primetime segment. Mark glanced over at Bruno, who was contentedly chewing a tennis ball mailed from Ohio. "That's not why we did." "This I know," Reyes replied. "But people need stories like this, especially now." They didn't make the trip. Mark turned down the offer, citing that Bruno wasn't fond of flying. The truth was, neither of them liked being in the spotlight. Instead, they spent the week on duty. Fame didn't change the fact that people still went missing. Emergencies still happened, and every morning Bruno showed up right on time, alert and ready. One afternoon, they responded to a call about an elderly hiker who had gone off trail in a nearby nature reserve. The man's phone had died, and old injuries had left him unable to walk far. Bruno located him within the hour, curled up under a fallen log, shivering and frightened but alive. No reporters, no press, just another saved life. Another quiet win. Later that week, they visited Luke's elementary school. It wasn't something Mark would have normally agreed to, but Luke's teacher had sent a heartfelt handwritten request asking if the kids could meet the dog who had rescued their friend. The classroom was a sensory overload, sticky fingers, unfamiliar scents, but Bruno handled it with grace. He sat patiently as Luke recounted the bark that saved me, and even wagged his tail when a student asked if he could shake hands. Afterward, as they walked toward the parking lot, Luke jogged a few steps beside them, then paused and looked at Bruno. "You didn't just save me," he said. "You found me." Mark tilted his head. "You remember?" Luke nodded. "I couldn't move, I was scared, but then I heard him bark, and I knew someone was coming. That's why I stayed awake." Bruno stood still, gazing at the boy. Then, without being prompted, he stepped forward and gently pressed his nose to Luke's chest. Luke laughed softly. "See, he remembers me." Mark smiled. "Yeah, he remembers." That night, wrapped in a blanket with a cold beer in hand, Mark sat on the back porch. Fall had settled in, the trees beginning to shed. Bruno lay close by, head resting on his paws, eyes fluttering as he dozed. Mark looked down. "You know what? I realized." Buddy Bruno's ear twitched. "Everyone keeps saying you're a hero because you barked, but that's not it. You're a hero because you stayed. You didn't give up, you waited, you knew he was there, and you made sure we did too." Bruno didn't move, but he didn't need to. 3 days later, a letter arrived. The envelope was small, with "For Bruno and Mark II" written in blue crayon. Mark opened it while parked outside a firehouse. Inside was a child's drawing, rough but unmistakable. It showed a boy, a dog, and a canyon. Above them, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "When I grow up, I want to be brave like Bruno." Mark swallowed hard, folding the note with slow, careful hands as though it were something precious, because, in a way, it was. Mark reached out. and scratched gently behind Bruno's ear. "Looks like that makes two of us." In early November, Bruno received another commendation, this time from the State's Search and Rescue Council. The event was modest, much more understated than the previous one. No flashing cameras, just fellow professionals, a few familiar faces, and some new ones. Mark hadn't written a speech. Dressed in his formal uniform, he stepped up, cleared his throat and said, "I've worked with many partners over the years, but none quite like this one. Bruno doesn't speak, but somehow, he says more than most people I've met. He doesn't chase the noise, he listens for the quiet. And, when something doesn't feel right, he doesn't walk away. He waits. He stays until someone hears him." Mark looked down at the German Shepherd, sitting calmly at his side. "That's the reason a little boy is still here today." There was a quiet pause, then applause. Bruno didn't flinch. He just sat steady, as if he understood it wasn't about praise, it was about purpose. When Thanksgiving came, Mark did what he always did. With no close family nearby, he grilled turkey, made an absurd amount of mashed potatoes, and gave Bruno half of everything. They sat together in the living room. Football played quietly in the background, and the fireplace crackled low in the hearth. Mark looked at Bruno, curled up on the rug nearby. "You know," he said, "I used to think I rescued you. But I think it's the other way around." Bruno lifted his eyes. No bark, no sound, just a look that said he understood. By the time Christmas rolled in, the headlines had moved on. New scandals, new distractions. But at a quiet cabin tucked away in northern Colorado, a man and his dog sat side by side, watching the snowdrift silently past the window. And not far from there, in a small town, a young boy hung an ornament on his family's Christmas tree. It was shaped like a German Shepherd, with Bruno written across it in silver marker. Because not all heroes wear capes. Some wear service vests, some walk on four legs. And some change lives, not with words, but with a single bark and the courage to stay when it matters most. Snow came early that year. By mid-December, the mountains were buried in white, and pine branches hung heavy with frost, looking dusted. In powdered sugar, everything felt quieter, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to begin again. Mark Hanley didn't mind the cold. He appreciated it. The cold kept things sharp. It was honest. Zipping up his thick jacket, he gave a low whistle. Bruno trotted in from the hallway, his collar jingling with each step. They were headed to the VA base at Fort Carson, a place Mark hadn't set foot in 4 years. But this trip wasn't for him. It was for Bruno. Everyone had talked about what Bruno did in the canyon, but no one had asked what he did before that. Mark had started looking quietly into the past, following the trail. It had led him here. The VA office was small, its walls lined with black and white photos of working dogs, German Shepherds. Labs, a few Belgian Malinois, frozen midleap with jaws wide. Mark signed in at the desk, showed his badge, and waited. A few minutes later, a man with a thick silver beard stepped into the lobby. "You must be Hanley," he said. "I'm Sergeant Ray Elkins. Retired, I was Bruno's kennel commander." They shook hands, firm, respectful. "I brought him with me," Mark said. Gesturing behind him, Bruno stepped in quietly, tail low but relaxed. He sniffed the air once, then walked straight up to Ray and sat down at his feet. Ray's expression softened. "Well, I'll be," he remembers. They moved to a back room that had been turned into a kind of tribute, part war room, part memorial. Medals hung beside frayed collars. On one wall was a faded but clear photo. A young man in desert fatigues, kneeling beside an alert German Shepherd. "That's Staff Sergeant Colin Roma," Ray said, nodding at the image. He and Bruno served together in Kuna Province, Afghanistan. That was 2018. Mark stared at the picture. Was he Bruno's original handler? Ray nodded. From day one, the bond between them can't fake that. For the first 6 months, Bruno wouldn't let anyone else near him. Mark glanced down. Bruno was sitting still, eyes fixed on the photo. "He's been through more than most people know." Mark murmured. Ray exhaled slowly. They cleared over 75 routes for IEDs, found 15 live devices, saved a lot of lives. But during their third tour, Colin was shot by a sniper. Routine sweep. Bruno was right there. He wouldn't leave his side. Stayed with the body nearly 9 hours. We had to sedate him just to bring him back. Mark felt something heavy settle in his chest. Did he ever work again? He asked. We didn't think he would, Ray admitted. For months, he didn't respond to commands, barely ate, just stared at the door like he expected Colin to walk through it. He paused. But you, you gave him a new start. Mark shook his head. No, he gave me one. They sat in silence for a while, letting Bruno explore. He sniffed an old duffel bag, pawed gently at a wooden plaque, and then lay down in front of the photo of Colin like it was the most natural place for him to be. Can I ask you something? Mark said finally. Of course. Did Colin have any family? Ray nodded. A sister. Teaches art somewhere up in Montana. Why? Mark rubbed his jaw. I think she should know. About Bruno, what he's still doing. Ray smiled, eyes misting slightly. I think you're right. On the drive home, snow spun gently in the headlights as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Mark glanced at Bruno in the passenger seat. You miss him, he said quietly. Yeah, I get that. Some partners never really leave. Bruno kept his gaze forward, steady and silent. Mark reached out and gently rested his hand on the dog's back. You waited patiently, and when the moment arrived, you didn't falter. You found that boy like it had always been your calling. Bruno blinked slowly. I think Colin would have been proud. A few days later, a letter arrived. It came in a light blue envelope with careful handwriting and no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photo. The picture showed a teenage Colin beaming, with his arms wrapped around a younger girl who clearly adored him. On the back, it read, Me and my big brother, duas mil, in novimas. The letter began, Dear Sergeant Hanley, thank you for reaching out. When Bruno was transferred, I didn't know if I'd ever hear about him again. But learning what he did for that boy, for your teammate, felt like Colin was still out there, making a difference. Bruno was always what he talked about, he said. He wasn't just a dog, he was his brother, in a world that often didn't make sense. He used to say, Run sees what we miss. I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way. But I believe you're the right person for him. Thank you for giving him a purpose again. With appreciation, Maggie Roma. Mark folded the letter with care and placed it in the drawer next to his bed. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because some truths are too personal to put on display. Some things you keep close because you know how deeply they matter. On Christmas Eve, Mark and Bruno were called out to help search for a teenage girl who had gone missing from her family's cabin. Snow was coming down hard. Visibility was poor, and the conditions were harsh. Deep snowbanks, frozen branches snapping underfoot. They found her just after midnight, curled beneath a pine tree, lost after an argument with her father. She had wandered off wearing only a hoodie and sneakers. Bruno picked up her trail in under half an hour. She was freezing, shaken, and barely able to speak. Mark wrapped his jacket around her and called in for emergency pickup. Bruno pressed against her side, helping to keep her warm until help arrived. She kept murmuring the same words over and over. Good dog, good dog, good dog. Back at the station, the team clapped, and some even cheered. But Bruno wasn't interested in the praise. He walked quietly to his mat in the back corner, curled up, and exhaled deeply, like he'd just turned the final page of a story. Only he had read. Mark sat down beside him, leaning against the wall, letting the rest of the room disappear. You know what I think? He said softly. Bruno's ears twitched. I think you're still on Colin's mission. Every time you find someone, every time you keep going, no matter what it's like, you're honoring him. You didn't lose him. You brought him with you. Bruno let out a quiet breath and rested his head on Mark's lap. And that night, for the first time in years, Mark let the tears fall not out of sorrow, but because he finally understood how quietly grief transforms into purpose. Just before 7 a.m., the phone rang. Mark was halfway through his second mug of black coffee, watching the snow pile up on the porch steps. The call came from a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something made him pick up. Hanley, a soft, familiar voice came through the line, hesitant and a bit unsure. "Hey, Sergeant Hanley, it's Luke. Luke Jensen." Mark straightened up, his coffee mug lightly tapping the counter. "Well, hey kid, good to hear your voice." There was a pause. Is Bruno okay?" Luke asked. Mark looked down. The shepherd was lying by the fireplace, stretched out in his usual regal pose, chin resting on his paws. "He's doing great," Mark replied. "Still recovering from a long weekend shift. We tracked a lost hunter on Saturday up in the national forest. Bruno didn't stop until we found him cold and worn out, but alive," he smiled. "Your dog still has it." Luke gave a small, nervous laugh, then fell quiet again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Mark said. "I've been writing a school speech. It's for a project about heroes. Everyone else picked Lincoln or Harriet Tubman or someone like that. But I chose Bruno." Mark felt his throat tighten. "Would it be okay? If I came to see him again, I'd like a photo for the presentation, but really, I just want to visit him." Mark nodded, even though Luke couldn't see it. "I think he'd like that," he said. "When were you thinking?" "Tomorrow, if that's all right." "Tomorrow's perfect." The next day was bright and clear, not a cloud in the sky. Mark stood on the porch, jacket zipped up, arms crossed, watching as a silver SUV pulled into the driveway. Karen Jensen stepped out first, brushing snow off the windshield. Then Luke got out, taller now, a rounder face, eyes bright behind black-rimmed glasses, still a kid, but older than Mark remembered. "Grief can do that, to matures the soul in ways nothing else does," Bruno, sensing familiar company, got up from his bed and trotted to the front door, his tail swaying slowly. Luke spotted him right away and ran forward, no hesitation, no awkwardness. "Bruno." He called Dot, and then Bruno did something Mark hadn't seen him do with anyone since Colin. He let out a soft, high-pitched whine, joyful, emotional. Luke dropped to his knees in the snow and wrapped his arms around the shepherd's neck. Bruno buried his face in the boy's chest, tail wagging, ears back. Karen stood off to the side, quietly wiping her eyes. "I think he remembers," she said. Mark nodded. "They both do." Inside, they warmed up with hot cocoa and coffee. Luke pulled out his speech notes, handwritten in pencil, on a wrinkled sheet of notebook paper. "I'm not the best writer," he admitted. Mark read it slowly. It didn't need polish. It didn't need big words. It was just right. "My hero doesn't talk. He doesn't wear a cape, but he listens. When no one else heard me, he did. When I was scared and trapped, it was Bruno's bark that gave me hope. But he didn't just bark, he stayed. He stayed until someone came. That's what heroes do, and that's why I want to be like him." After the cocoa was finished and the fire had burned low, Luke asked if he and Bruno could take a walk, just the two of them. "Just me and him?" he asked. Mark hesitated for a moment, then gave a nod. "Stick to the trail behind the cabin. Don't go too far." Karen gave Mark a thankful look. Bruno walked beside Luke as though no time had passed. He didn't need a leash. There was an invisible thread between them, silent and strong. Together, they vanished into the woods. Mark stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, heart beating louder than he expected. They were gone for nearly half an hour. When they returned, Luke's cheeks were red from the cold, but his smile could have melted the snow. "He still remembers the canyon," he said. "He walked beside me the whole way. Even stopped and looked up at the ridge like we were back there." Mark gave a soft smile. "You all right?" he asked gently. Luke gave a small nod. "I think I finally am." A week later, Mark received a call from Luke's school. "We're organizing a community celebration," the principal said. "It's all about local heroes. Luke nominated Bruno. We'd be honored if both of you could attend." Mark agreed, though he kept his hopes modest. Still, nothing could have prepared him for the scene they walked into. A massive banner stretched across the back of the auditorium. Welcome, our hometown. Hero, Bruno. Children wore handmade paper dog ears. Teachers handed out buttons that read "Bark for Bruno." There was even a cake shaped like a dog, bone made of peanut butter and oats, just for him. Bruno looked less than thrilled by the attention, but when Luke stepped onto the stage with a microphone, Bruno walked right up beside him and sat proudly. The room fell completely silent. Luke held the mic tightly with both hands. His voice trembled slightly. "I used to think heroes had to be loud," he began. "Like the kind who crash through doors or fly through the sky." He glanced at Bruno. "But sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stay. Stay even when it's hard. Stay when it's scary. Stay when others walk away. Stay because someone out there might really need you." He paused, then added quietly, "That's what Bruno did for me." There wasn't a single dry eye. In the crowd, that evening, back at the cabin, Mark and Bruno sat together by the fireplace. Mark gave him an extra serving of grilled chicken. Bruno accepted it without surprise. "You've changed that boy's life," Mark murmured, twice. "Now." Bruno lifted his head, blinked slowly, and leaned into Mark's hand. "You're more than a working dog," Mark said. "You're a guardian, your family," and for the first time in a long time, Mark didn't feel like he was just talking to a dog, he felt like he was speaking to a friend. A week later, an email came in from Maggie Rorqual's sister. She had watched Luke's speech online. "I cried through the entire thing," she wrote. "It reminded me of something Colin used to say about Bruno, that he didn't just protect people, he gave them the courage to protect themselves. I don't know what you believe, Mark, but I think Bruno still carries a part of Colin with him. And maybe now he's passing that strength on to Luke." Mark closed his laptop and gazed out the window. The world outside was still, but something stirred inside him, maybe hope, maybe peace. Later that month, Luke and his mother came by one last time before school resumed. They brought a gift, a wooden plaque, hand-carved, with a photo of Bruno in the canyon. The inscription at the bottom read, "A hero's bark echoes forever." Mark hung it over the fireplace. Bruno lay underneath it, tail thumping once, as if to give his approval. That night, as snow began to drift down again, Mark finally said what had been on his heart. "I don't know how many missions you've got left in you, old friend," he said softly, "but if today was the last, you've already done more than enough." Bruno looked up at him, eyes calm and wise, as if he already understood. Then he rested his head on Mark's boot and closed his eyes. Outside, the forest was quiet. Inside, a boy slept soundly, a mother smiled gently in the dark, and a man leaned back in his chair finally at peace, knowing he had witnessed something rare, a quiet kind of heroism, the kind that asks for nothing, but changes everything. 10 years passed still, when the wind swept through the pine trees near the old rescue station in Lamar County. Some locals swore they could hear a bark echo across the canyon. Some said it was just the wind, others weren't so sure. Inside that same building, now renovated, with polished floors and a small memorial wall near the front desk, a young man in uniform sat behind the counter. His nameplate read L. Jensen. To newer team members, the name meant little, but to the veterans, it stirred something. Luke Jensen was 21 now. Taller, stronger, steady in the way of someone who had learned resilience through loss. His boots were laced tight, his canine vest freshly fastened. His badge still had the protective film on it. But none of that was what made Mark Hanley proud. What made him proud was the sleek, focused shepherd sitting at Luke's side. Not Bruno. Bruno had passed quietly in his sleep 3 years earlier, his head resting on Mark's lap as the fire faded and the leash was never pulled again. The new dog was Daisy, jet black coat, alert eyes, ears like radar, and she'd been trained by the best. Mark still worked with the team, mostly in an advisory role these days. His knees ached, his back complained with every weather shift, but he still came by the station in the mornings, sipping bitter coffee and trading stories with the younger handlers. When Luke walked into the room that morning for his first official Mission briefing. Mark just shook his head with a grin. Look at you, he said. All grown up. Did you eat, or are you going to faint halfway up the ridge? Luke smirked. Eggs, toast, and 3 cups of gas station coffee. I'm ready, and Daisy. Luke looked down at the shepherd. She was ready before I was. Mark chuckled. Then you picked the right one. The call came in an hour later. A hiker had gone missing near Devil's Thumb Trail. Left yesterday afternoon, hadn't come back. No cell signal. Temperatures falling fast. Mark watched from the operations trailer as Luke and Daisy loaded up the rig. He didn't say much, just handed Luke a scarf. Bruno's Luke asked quietly, You sure? Mark nodded. It belongs out there, not sitting in a drawer. Luke tied it around his neck and climbed into the truck. Mark stood in the cold, one hand raised in farewell. Same road, same mission, a new chapter. They found the hiker by nightfall. An older man in his 60s who had slipped into a ravine and broken his ankle. He was weak, shaking, on the verge of hypothermia when Daisy began barking near the trail's edge. Luke didn't hesitate. He followed her down the slope, trusting her instincts. When they reached the injured man, Daisy curled up beside him, pressing close to warm him just like Bruno had done for Luke so long ago. Back at headquarters, Mark watched it unfold via drone footage. He leaned closer to the screen, blinking away the sting in his eyes. That's my boy, he whispered. Just like your old man. 2 weeks later, Luke received his first canine commendation, and a generous slice of cheese for Daisy. The story made it into the local newspaper. The headline read, Boy saved by dog now becomes one. It was printed, framed, and mounted on the wall at the station, right next to Bruno's plaque. Mark snapped a photo of Luke standing beneath the article. Daisy sitting proudly at his side, and emailed it to Maggie Roma. She responded with a single sentence. That dog sparked something and it's still burning. Life went on. Luke grew into a dependable handler, quiet, focused, and unshakable in a crisis. He didn't chase recognition. He wasn't interested in awards or attention, he just did the work. Sound familiar? Before long, folks in town began recognizing Daisy's bark the same way they once recognized Bruno's. Schoolkids even started calling her Bruno's niece. Mark never corrected them. It just felt right. Karen Jensen Luke's mum eventually moved closer to the area. She joined the department's outreach team, visiting schools, supporting families who'd lost someone to the wilderness, and helping organize volunteers. She had found her place too. One afternoon, after a storm had cleared from the hills, Mark and Luke stood on the back porch of the cabin. Same porch Bruno had once guarded. Same view stretching out into the woods. Same clean mountain air. I still hear that bark, Luke said softly. It's been 10 years, and I still catch it when the world goes quiet enough. Mark smiled. Some sounds don't disappear. Luke glanced over. Do you ever miss it? The fieldwork? Mark nodded, slow and thoughtful. Every day, but I don't worry about it anymore. Now I get to watch someone else carry the torch. Luke looked down at Daisy. She's not him. No, Mark agreed. She's her own dog, but she carries what he left behind. The instincts, the loyalty, the heart. They stood together in silence, letting the moment breathe. Then Luke asked a question he'd never voiced before. Do you think he knew what would come from all this? That finding me would lead to everything that followed? Mark looked up. At the sky, now scattered with stars. I don't know if dogs see the future the way we do, but I do believe they see people. Bruno chose you, just like he once chose Colin. That means something. Luke gave a quiet smile. I hope he's proud. Mark didn't hesitate. He already was. The day you came back. When the time came, the station held a ceremony to honor Bruno's memory. A bronze statue was unveiled, a life-sized sculpture, capturing him mid-stride, ears perked, nose pointed ahead. The plaque below read, He barked and the world listened. Canine Bruno, service dog, search partner, lifesaver, forever family. Luke delivered the closing remarks. He didn't read a long speech. just stood there in his uniform, scarf tucked neatly into his vest, Daisy seated beside him. His voice was steady. Bruno didn't save me to make me famous. He saved me so I could live. And now, I get to help others do the same. He turned to the statue and added, "Wherever you are, I hope you know, I'm still listening." Later that evening, after the guests had left and the lights had dimmed, Mark stayed out on the porch alone. He stared into the trees as snow began falling again, gentle, steady, silent. And then, in the quiet, he thought he heard it, a single bark, far off, carried by the wind through the ridgeline. He smiled and whispered, "Good boy. Thank you for following Bruno's journey."